Nobody knew what she'd done before she picked up a stethoscope. Nobody asked. She was quiet, careful, precise with her hands in a way that made the wounded trust her and the loud ones underestimate her. She changed dressings in the dark, navigated the chaos of a field hospital at 2 a.m. like she'd been born moving through it, and never once raised her voice when the world around her was unraveling. They called her the night nurse. Just that. No last name thrown around. No rank commanding respect in the tent corridors. Just a woman in scrubs, moving between cots, checking vitals, keeping men alive who had no business still being alive. And then the night came when 6 armed insurgents cut through the perimeter wire. And the night nurse walked toward them. Not away. Toward. Before we show you exactly what happened inside that field hospital, and the line she delivered that made a hardened combat veteran go completely silent, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and stay right here. Because this story doesn't end the way anyone expected it to. Least of all the men who came through that wire, thinking a medical tent full of nurses and wounded soldiers was going to be easy. FOB Kestrel sat in a valley that nobody had bothered to name on the newer maps. Just a grid reference and a color code that meant contested terrain. The mountains on 3 sides were beautiful the way dangerous things always are. Sharp and clean and utterly indifferent to the people dying in their shadows. The field hospital was the 6th structure built and the most important one standing. Tan canvas walls, rubber flooring, generator-powered fluorescents that hummed like they were complaining. 12 beds, sometimes 20 patients. The overflow lay on cots in the supply corridor, which smelled like antiseptic and old canvas and the particular metallic weight of blood that never fully aired out. Specialist Darnell Okafor arrived on a Tuesday with shrapnel in his left thigh and a story he told anyone who'd listen about how he'd walked 3 kilometers on it before admitting something was wrong. He was 22. He talked a lot. He was the kind of patient who needed to fill silence like it was a threat. The nurse who cleaned and packed his wound didn't say much back. She was somewhere in her late 30s. Dark brown skin, close-cropped natural hair tucked under a soft cap, gloves already on before she reached his cot. Her name badge said Adaeze, which nobody in the tent pronounced correctly, so most people didn't try. She moved with a stillness that Okafor found unsettling at first. Not coldness. She asked if the pressure hurt, adjusted her grip when he flinched, checked twice before she committed to anything. But she never seemed rushed the way the other staff did. Never seemed rattled. Even when Captain Briggs came in yelling about supply shortages and a medevac that had been delayed 6 hours, she just looked up from what she was doing, registered it, and looked back down. Like she was categorizing the noise and filing it away somewhere it couldn't touch her. "You always this calm?" Okafor asked on his second night there. She didn't look up. Calm keeps people alive. "What keeps you calm?" She pressed the last piece of tape flat against his dressing. Didn't answer. Just moved to the next cot. "You watch her go." Asked the medic who relieved her at 0600 about her. "Night nurse." The medic shrugged. "She's been here 8 months. Doesn't talk about before. Does her job better than anyone here. Maybe better than anyone I've ever seen." He paused. "Why? She do something?" Okafor looked at the doorway she'd walked through. "No," he said. "That's exactly it. She didn't do anything. That's what's strange." The staff at FOB Kestrel's medical unit had learned not to ask questions that didn't improve patient outcomes. People arrived at forward operating bases trailing histories they'd packed carefully into the corners of their silence. And prying those corners open helped nobody. You worked with who was in front of you. You assessed what they could do, not what they'd done. Adaeze Nwosu had requested this posting. That was in the file. That was the one thing the administrative officer, a perpetually exhausted captain named Folsom, had noted when processing her rotation. Most medical personnel were assigned forward. They didn't volunteer for the contested grid references. They didn't circle the worst ones on the map and submit a formal request through Joint Command. She had. Folsom had looked at the paperwork twice, checked it against her service record, and then done the thing that overworked administrative officers do when the paperwork is technically in order and the need is genuine. He approved it. He did not read far enough back in her service record to reach the years before nursing school. Nobody did. So nobody knew that Adaeze Nwosu had spent 4 years attached to a long-range reconnaissance unit as a designated marksman. Nobody knew about the qualification badges packed flat at the bottom of her personal kit, or the citation written in language so sanitized it said almost nothing while describing something extraordinary. Nobody knew that the hands redressing Okafor's thigh wound had, in a different theater, in a different life, been the steadiest hands in a hide site at 600 meters, waiting. She had left that life for reasons she didn't discuss. She had carried everything she learned from it into the one she'd chosen next. And on a Wednesday night in late autumn, when the temperature dropped hard and the generator stuttered twice before catching, it turned out she'd needed to. It started the way bad things start in places like FOB Kestrel. Not with a sound that made sense immediately, but with the absence of one. The perimeter radio check at 0140 hours produced silence. Not static, not broken signal, just nothing, which was worse than both. Adaeze was at the far end of the ward, helping a fever patient drink water, when she heard it. The silence had a shape. She'd learned that a long time ago in a different kind of darkness. Silence that meant the world had gone still naturally felt different from silence that meant something had gone wrong. She set the cup down. "Try to sleep," she told the patient quietly. Then she straightened, moved to the supply cabinet at the rear of the tent, and stood in front of it for exactly 3 seconds before opening it. Inside, beneath a sealed medical kit she'd organized herself, was a Glock 19 in a flat holster. Properly logged, properly cleared, issued to medical personnel authorized to carry in contested zone postings. She drew it and checked it without looking at her hands. Eyes on the tent entrance. Ears calibrated to what lay beyond it. She reholstered, left the flap of the holster unsnapped. Then she went back into the ward and began, quietly, without explanation, moving the patients who could be moved. Not urgently, not with enough energy to start a panic. Just adjusting positions, nudging cots, creating a specific geometry in the tent that nobody would have recognized for what it was unless they'd done tactical room preparation before. She had. Private Yemi, a 20-year-old with a fractured wrist and too much alertness for his own good, pushed himself up on one elbow and watched her rearrange the cot beside his. "Something wrong?" he whispered. She looked at him. Probably not. Stayed down regardless. She held his gaze long enough for him to understand she meant it. He lay back down. 3 minutes later, the first insurgent came through the tent flap. There were 6 of them. She'd already counted the boot sounds. They entered in 2 groups, front and rear, which told her something. Someone had planned this. Someone had looked at the layout of FOB Kestrel, identified the field hospital as a soft target. No armor, no heavy weapons, a building full of people who couldn't run, and built an approach around that assumption. The assumption was mostly correct. The lead insurgent was broad through the shoulders and moved like he'd done this before. He swept his rifle across the ward, taking in the cots, the fluorescent hum, the 2 nurses frozen near the medication cabinet, the wounded men, and then her. She was standing at the center of the ward. Not hiding. Standing. Arms at her sides, stethoscope around her neck, scrubs unmarked. No sudden movements. No expression of fear that might accelerate a decision she didn't want accelerated. Just presence. He moved the barrel of his rifle toward her, said something in a dialect she partially understood. She caught the words for weapons, for kneel for now. She answered him in the same dialect. Not perfectly, but fluently enough. He blinked. It was a small thing, but she cataloged it. Unexpected fluency was a disruption. Disruption created a pause. Pause was time, and time was what the men in those cots needed. She said, slowly and clearly, that there were no combatants in this building, only the wounded and the people keeping them alive. She said it the way you state a fact in a situation where the other person hasn't decided yet what kind of situation this is. The lead insurgent's jaw shifted. Behind him, one of his men had moved to the supply shelves and was sweeping his light across them. Another had prodded a patient with the barrel of his rifle. The patient, Specialist Okafor, made a sound of pain that cut across the tent like a knife. Adeeze's eyes moved to that corner. Once. Precise. Then back to the lead man. "Tell him to step back from the patient," she said. Still calm. Same register. Same flat surgical tone that didn't go up at the end like a request and didn't go hard like a threat. He was trying to figure her out. She could see it. This wasn't what a soft target looked like. A soft target flinched and scrambled and gave you the room. This woman was giving him nothing. No fear, no submission, no hostility he could use as permission. It was making him uncertain. Uncertainty was the second thing she'd been counting on. The first thing she'd been counting on was the corporal. Corporal James Whitfield had been in the ward for 11 days. Collapsed lung, 3 fractured ribs, a left arm he couldn't rotate past 90 degrees. He couldn't fight. He'd proven that to himself privately every morning when he tried to assess what he'd be able to do if something happened in here. But he had a functioning right arm, and Adaeze had spent 3 of the last 11 evenings talking to him about things that weren't medicine. About angles. About where the light came from. About how the rear supply flap was never properly secured and opened outward on the left side. She'd been doing it in a way that sounded like conversation. He understood now that it had been briefing. When the second group of insurgents entered through the rear, Whitfield was already watching the gap beside the supply shelf. She'd moved the cots so the angle was clean. She positioned herself at center so the insurgents' eyes would track to her automatically, leaving the edges of the room in peripheral territory. The supply shelf blocked the sight line from the rear group to the front. She'd moved it 3 days ago. Rearranging, she called it. More accessible for night shifts. The rear insurgents moved through without registering Whitfield, pressed against the wall at the edge of the shelf. He had one functional arm. She'd given him the one thing one functional arm required. A clear shot. She never telegraphed it. That was the thing the lead insurgent couldn't have prepared for because it violated everything that combat training tells you about threat recognition. You look for the shoulder drop, the weight shift, the breath held before action. Every person who has ever been trained to fight carries those signals embedded in muscle and bone. You read people by reading their body. Adeeze's body said nothing. One moment she was still. The next she had stepped left, drawn, and put 2 rounds into the armed man who had his rifle pressed against Okafor's shoulder. Clean. Final. The tent filled with the sound, and then swallowed it. The lead insurgent spun toward her. She was already moving, not back, forward, closing distance, so the rifle was a liability instead of an advantage. Her left hand caught the barrel and redirected it. Her right came under his chin with the heel of her palm in a strike that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with 4 years learning how to survive up close when a long-distance option was gone. He went down. From the rear of the tent, 2 sharp cracks. Whitfield, while the rear group, was down. The other had turned toward the sound and was bringing his weapon up. She didn't look. She'd already calculated the geometry. Left, she called out. One word. Whitfield heard it. Dropped low. She fired across the tent in the same motion, over the cots, past the equipment rack. The insurgent dropped before his finger closed. 4 down in under 9 seconds. The remaining 2 at the rear entrance were already moving. She heard them. Footsteps on gravel, angle right, pulling back toward the wire. She didn't pursue. She re-engaged the room. She checked each down figure with the same systematic attention she brought to vital signs. Threat status confirmed. Then she moved to Okafor. The rifle had caught him on the existing wound. He was in pain, but breathing, pulse elevated but regular. You're okay, she told him. I need 30 seconds and then I'm back. She pulled her radio and reported contact, casualties, and position in the flat regulated language of someone filing an incident report, not someone who just cleared a room. Then she holstered, picked up her stethoscope where it had swung loose during the movement, straightened it. Private Yemi was staring at her from his cot with his mouth open. I told you to stay down, she said. He didn't answer. He didn't have anything that could reach what he'd just seen. The QRF arrived 11 minutes after a radio call. They came in hard, fast, weapons raised, ready for the scenario they'd been briefed on. What they found instead was a medical tent with 4 enemy combatants down, 2 nurses shaken but unhurt, 12 patients alive, and one woman in scrubs quietly rechecking 4 lines. Staff Sergeant Colton pulled up hard just inside the entrance. He scanned the room, looked at the bodies, looked at the positioning, looked at the modified patient layout that he, with 8 years in combat infantry, immediately recognized as deliberate tactical preparation. Then he looked at her. "You do this?" he asked. She checked the drip rate on the 4. The 4? Yes. It was running too fast. He blinked. "Ma'am, He gestured at the rest of the tent. She glanced over her shoulder at him. "Your crime scene report will be more accurate if you brief your team before they move through it." His mouth closed. He turned and quietly told his team not to move anything yet. When he came back, she was already writing her incident notes. He waited until she finished the sentence. Then he asked carefully, "What's your background?" She capped her pen, looked at him the way someone looks when they're deciding how much to give you. "Medical, 12 years. Before that." A pause. Not evasion, just the beat of someone selecting words. "Before that," she said, "I was in a different part of the same job." She picked up her clipboard and walked to the next patient. He stood there for a moment, watching her move through the ward like nothing unusual had happened. Like the night was just a night. "She a ghost?" one of his men murmured beside him. Colton shook his head slowly. "Worse," he said. "She's real." They interviewed Corporal Whitfield the following morning. He sat up in his cot with his ribs aching and his right arm sore in the good way, the way you feel after you've done something your body was waiting to be useful for. The investigating officer, a major named Crane, sat across from him with a recorder running and the particular expression of someone who has read a report they don't quite believe. "Walk me through it," Crane said. Whitfield did. All 11 minutes. The sounds before the breach. The way she'd moved through the ward in the hours before, rearranging the room. The conversations that he now understood hadn't been conversations. "She briefed you," Crane said. "She never called it that," Whitfield said. "But yeah, she gave you a firing position. She gave me a cleared sight line to a corner of the room, mentioned once that the shelf didn't completely block the view from that angle, and suggested I might be comfortable resting there given my ribs. She said the light was better." He paused. "She didn't tell me to do anything. She just made sure I could." Crane was quiet for a moment. Did she say anything before it started? Any indication she knew what was coming? Whitfield thought about it. The exact words. "Calm keeps people alive." She said calm was the thing that kept people alive, he said. "I thought she was talking about nursing." Crane looked down at her report. She was, he said. She just wasn't only talking about nursing. They brought her in for debriefing at 1,400 hours. Conference room in the command building. Metal chairs. One window. Major Crane and a woman from Joint Intelligence Command who had been flown in and hadn't introduced herself to anyone. Adaeze sat down, folded her hands on the table, and waited. Crane opened the file. Adaeze Nwosu, registered nurse. 8 months at FOB Kestrel. He flipped a page. Prior service, for years attached to 1st LRSC as a designated marksman. He looked up. "Why isn't this in your standard unit file?" "It is in my standard unit file," she said. "It's under the section titled Prior Service." It wasn't flagged. "Flagging requires someone to read it," she said. "Not unkind, just accurate." Crane's jaw worked slightly. "You could have disclosed it. I was hired as a nurse. I nurse. Everything else was available if anyone needed it." The woman from Joint Intelligence hadn't spoken yet. She was watching Adaeze the way a professional watches someone they're calibrating. Not hostile. Calculating. "Why nursing?" she asked. Adaeze looked at her for the first time. A full, direct look. "Because the men I spent 4 years watching from a distance are the same men who end up on those cots. I spent a long time working the problem from one end. I decided to work it from the other." The room held that for a moment. "And last night," Crane said, "when the perimeter went down," she looked at him, "I kept my patients alive. You cleared an armed incursion with 6 combatants using a service pistol and a one-armed corporal. I used what was available," she said. "That's always the job." He leaned forward. "There are people in this command who are going to want to move you, reassign you, put you somewhere more appropriate to what you clearly are." She didn't hesitate. "This posting is appropriate to what I am." He studied her. She studied him back. Neither one blinked. You requested this grid reference, he said. You requested the worst posting on the board. Yes. Why? She looked out the one window. The mountains were clean and sharp in the afternoon light. Beautiful the way dangerous things always were. Because nobody else did, she said. The field hospital was quieter for a day. Then it was louder. Word moved through FOB Kestrel the way word moved through any closed system under pressure. Fast, distorted at the edges, accurate at the center. By evening chow, everyone had heard a version of it. By the following morning, most of those versions had collapsed into something close to the truth, which was somehow more striking than any of the exaggerated ones. She hadn't shouted, hadn't called for help before engaging, had reorganized the room days in advance like she'd read something in the air that nobody else noticed, had spoken to the lead insurgent in his own language long enough to buy her patients a margin of time she then used to its precise limit. Private Yemi, who had a fractured ankle and approximately zero filter, told the story to every new patient who arrived on the ward. He told it with the slightly reverential energy of someone who had been present at something they didn't fully have the vocabulary for yet. She didn't even look scared, he kept saying. Not for 1 second. The nurse sitting at the medication station, listening without appearing to listen, said nothing. But one of the newer nurses, a young man 3 weeks into his first rotation, still learning how the night shifts worked, looked up from his notes and asked her quietly, "Were you scared?" Adaeze finished annotating the chart she was working on. Set the pen down. "There's a version of fear," she said, "that doesn't feel like fear. It feels like clarity. Everything gets very simple. You stop thinking about what could happen and you start processing what is happening." She picked up the pen again. "That's training. You practice until fear becomes data instead of noise." The young nurse thought about that. "How long does it take to get there?" She looked at him. "Depends on what you're willing to sit with." She stood, picked up the chart, and moved on to the next patient. He watched her go. Later that night, when the ward was dim and the generator had settled into its steady hum, Corporal Whitfield caught her eye from his cot. She walked over. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way people had been looking at her all day, with that stunned, slightly odd quality that she found more exhausting than combat. Just directly, one professional to another. "You sent me up to take that shot," he said. Quiet, not accusatory. "I gave you a position with a clear sight line," she said. "You made the choice." He held her gaze. "You trusted me with it." She pulled the blanket up on his left side where it had slipped. "Yes," she said. "I did." He nodded once. Slowly. The nod of someone who understood that they'd been seen, assessed, and found capable, and that this was its own form of respect. Possibly the most honest kind. "The ribs are going to need another 2 weeks," she said, professional and even. "I know," he said. She turned to go. "Hey," he said. She paused. "The shelf," he said. "You moved it 3 days ago. It was in an inefficient position." "Yeah." His voice was dry. "Sure it was." She walked back to her station without another word. But there was something in how she moved, something barely there, the faintest ease in her shoulders, that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. Major Crane filed his report on a Friday. It ran 14 pages, most of which were classified, and the summary described the incident in the careful neutral language of official documentation. The Joint Intelligence Officer added a 2-line addendum. She recommended Adaeze Nwosu for a commendation and for a posting review. The commendation came through. The posting review came through too, with a formal offer to transfer her to a joint training command where her combined skill set would be, in the words of the reviewing officer, more strategically positioned. She declined it. The letter she sent back was 3 sentences. Polite. Final. The last sentence read, "The patients at FOB Kestrel require continuity of care, and I am providing it." That was all. No one pushed further. Because there are people who hold their ground through argument, and there are people who hold it through presence, through the simple, unmovable fact of who they are and what they've decided to do. Adaeze Nwosu was the second kind. She had decided years ago, in a different kind of darkness, what she was willing to sit with, what she was willing to carry, what she was willing to walk toward. A field hospital at the edge of a contested valley was not a compromise. It was the point. 3 weeks after the breach, a new rotation of patients arrived. One of them, a young corporal with a road rash burn across half his forearm, looked around the ward when they brought him in, taking the measure of the place the way soldiers did in new environments. He watched the nurse at the far end of the ward change a dressing. Efficient, quiet, the room bending slightly toward her without anyone deciding to let it. He leaned toward the medic walking beside him. "Who's that?" The medic looked back at him. "Night nurse," he said. "She been here long?" 8 months. Maybe more now. The corporal watched her move to the next cot without breaking rhythm. "She any good?" The medic almost laughed. Didn't. Just shook his head like the question was a language he didn't have the translation for anymore. "She's the reason some of those men are still breathing," he said. Then, after a pause, "All of them, actually." The corporal looked at her one more time. She hadn't looked up. Wasn't performing unawareness the way some people did. She was just working, entirely given over to the task in front of her, carrying everything she'd ever learned in the only direction that had ever made sense to her, toward the people who needed it. If you found out someone you trusted had a background like hers, something they never mentioned, never used to impress anyone, would that change how you saw them? Or does what they do right in front of you matter more than what they did before you met them? And here's the real question. How many people are walking through ordinary doors every day, carrying extraordinary things they've never been asked about? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story hit you the way it hit me, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you've got the bell icon turned on so you never miss another mission. Share this with someone who still thinks the quietest person in the room has nothing to say. Your next story is already on screen. Go watch it now. We'll see you tomorrow.